Good afternoon.
It's true.
Welcome to the fifth in our series of cafes on the general topic of what makes a healthy society. I'll introduce our speaker in a minute, but I wanted to tell you first, or reassure you first, that planning is taking place with regard to a series in the winter, right? In fact, we have a number of animateurs already lined up, and the general theme is going to be something like matters of justice. So we'll be talking about questions of justice in areas like war, obligations to future generations, treaty obligations under the treaties between the First Nations and the Crown, and things of that sort. And so we'll be having an interesting bunch of animateurs in to discuss these justice matters. Now, I want to say that, let me get my program. The cafes that we have coming up, as you know, they come every 2 weeks. So the next one will be 2 weeks from now. And it's got a very long title. I don't know how we allowed this title to expand to this degree. Can the cultivation of civic democracy unite into one country a variety of ethnic cultures and national identities? It's obviously put in a very general terms, but I think you know what country we have in mind. Okay, and that's going to be animated by John van Heiking, who's the Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Lethbridge. So that's going to be on Saturday, the 26th of November. And then our last cafe will be on Saturday, the 10th of December, just before winter comes in. And that's going to be on the topic, is a diversity of religious communities a help or a hindrance to a healthy society? And no surprise about the animateur for this one, it's going to be our own David Goa. Who I'm afraid is not here this week. He's off giving lectures on something or other in Toronto, right? So 2 more cafes coming up, and now we can turn to our present cafe. The topic for our cafe today is, what are the limits to reasonable accommodation? The reference, of course, is to the Reasonable Accommodation legislation and debate in Quebec. And I'm very pleased to have a newcomer to our cafes. No, just, but it's Reasonable Accommodation, right. And don't worry, it doesn't have to be on Quebec, right, no. And our animateur today is Lisa Kline, who I knew quite a few years ago as a student in the philosophy department. She did a master's degree in philosophy at the U of A, and then went on to the University of Illinois down in Champaign-Urbana, and completed a dissertation there on this general topic of arguments for and against religious freedom and the limits of religious freedom. She's currently has a full-time research position in the dentistry department, but she is also teaching a course in the philosophy department. So I'm going to turn this over to Lisa Kline and let her animate the discussion. Lisa.
to Reasonable Accommodation. As Martin noted, is the title that was assigned to this talk. Since I'm going to be focusing on religious accommodation, and specifically, a more accurate title would be, Are there reasonable limits to religious accommodation? My short answer is yes, and now here's my long answer. Freedom of religion, including the accommodation of different religious beliefs and practices, is often considered to be a cornerstone of societies like Canada, allowing individuals to choose whether or not to follow a set of religious beliefs, including upholding the practices that arise from those beliefs, seems to lie at the heart of the individual rights embodied by our laws and our Constitution. However, what is often overlooked or simply ignored is the fact that religious freedom is an oxymoron for many individuals. While they may be religious, they are certainly not free. Freedom, in the sense of being able to make individual choices for oneself and to enjoy the full extent of individual rights granted in a society like ours, is sometimes denied to people, and especially to women and sometimes children, who live in religious communities and families that practice a strict fundamentalist form of their religion. I'm using the term fundamentalist to represent more extreme religious beliefs. The words evangelical or radical are also sometimes used in this context. This is in contrast to moderate believers in a religion who will interpret their religious doctrines in light of contemporary knowledge and understanding, and they'll adapt their religious practices to contemporary laws and rights. Fundamentalists, on the other hand, choose a more literal interpretation of religious texts, or at least an interpretation put forth by a specific religious authority, adhering to traditional religious practices that sometimes conflict with contemporary laws, rights, and freedoms. As my discussion unfolds, it'll be clear as to what sorts of religious practices I'm referring to, and hopefully it'll also be clear how these practices violate individual rights and why it's not reasonable to accommodate them in our society. I'm going to propose 6 specific individual rights that should always be upheld. I'll talk about some of the specific religious practices that violate these rights. I'll present some of the arguments that are given to support these practices being accommodated, and why I think that these arguments are unacceptable. And finally, I'll suggest a few ways that countries like Canada can actively discourage, prohibit, and maybe even someday eliminate religious practices that violate individual rights. The 6 individual rights that I propose are certainly not meant to be an exhaustive list of human rights to be upheld by societies like ours. The reason I chose these 6 rights will be demonstrated in the examples that I will provide. You will see that these 6 rights are most likely to be violated by certain fundamentalist religious practices. These 6 rights can therefore be used as clear guidelines within which religious accommodation can reasonably be limited in our society. If religious groups uphold these rights for all of their members, then there's no problem. But if they violate them, then they've gone beyond the reasonable limits of accommodation, and they must be held accountable, as would anybody else who violates them. Here are the 6 rights that I propose and a brief description of each one. First, every individual should have the right to life and not have their life taken from them on the basis of another person's beliefs. 2, every individual should have the right to personal security and not suffer harm based on another person's beliefs. Number 3, every individual should have the right to personal liberty, and that they ought to have the freedom to make their own choices about how to live their lives and not be inhibited or prevented due to the beliefs of another person. 4, every individual should have the right to education, including a comprehensive education in childhood and equal access to education in adulthood. 5, every individual should have the right to choice and equality in marriage, meaning that marriage shall be entered into only with the free and full consent of both spouses, that men and women are entitled to equal rights as to marriage, during marriage, and at its dissolution, and all spouses must have equal rights in determining how many children to have, if any. And number 6, every individual should have the right to freedom of or from religion, which includes the right to choose which, if any, religious beliefs to hold. I believe that it's extremely important to interpret the freedom of religion as an individual right and not as a group right, in order to protect individuals from religious group practices that may violate this right. I'll explain the concept of a group right shortly. Many fundamentalist religious practices are based upon the belief that women should be treated differently from men, and this often means that women are not given the same rights and freedoms as men. All of the major religions in their fundamentalist forms are guilty of perpetuating the oppression of women. In fundamentalist Islam and its adherence to Sharia laws, one can find many obvious examples of practices that oppress women. For example, women must always obey the commands of men in their families. Women must adhere to strict clothing restrictions, often being unable to show any skin when they're out in public. Education for girls may be limited, and even if a girl receives a comprehensive education, she's still bound by strict rules that prohibit her from being able to make her own choices in life. Husbands are allowed to physically and sometimes sexually abuse their wives. Girls and young women are expected to accept arranged and forced marriages, sometimes to relatives. And on legal matters, spousal support for divorced females is sometimes only 3 months long. Only men can initiate divorce proceedings, and fathers are virtually always awarded custody of any children who have reached puberty. The most horrifying example of Sharia law is the practice of honor killing. If a woman or a girl is considered to have shamed her family, which is always determined by the men, and it can involve such actions as being alone with an unrelated man, dating someone of their choice, or even just wearing makeup, she can be murdered. While these practices may be carried out openly and legally in Islamic societies, they also occur in Canada and in many other Western societies. Of course, when honor killings occur in Canada, they're not tolerated or accommodated in any way, and the perpetrators are rightly charged with murder. However, a very distressing aspect to these murders is that inevitably, the men who commit them do not believe that they've done anything wrong, for they're merely upholding their religious beliefs. This seems to indicate that these men have also been oppressed, in that they've been indoctrinated into believing such things without question. Not that this should remove any responsibility from them, but it reveals a depth of oppression within these religious groups, demonstrating the incompatibility of fundamentalist beliefs with contemporary knowledge and understanding. Jews and Christians are also guilty of violating individual rights. For example, in ultra-Orthodox Judaism, women must accept early arranged marriage, they must live a purely domestic life, and in addition, women are not counted as part of the quorum necessary for prayers. They're not allowed to lead prayers. They cannot become rabbis or judges or hold any other public religious position. Their evidence is not acceptable in court, and they cannot obtain a divorce against their husband's will. Ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities are also very close-knit, so that the women within these groups are generally isolated from the mainstream of society, making it difficult for them to seek help and support if they're unhappy with their circumstances. There are also numerous fundamentalist Christian groups whose practices violate individual rights, particularly the rights of women, but also frequently the rights of children and young men. For example, in fundamentalist Latter-day Saints communities, otherwise known as the FLDS communities, it's common for girls to be expected to marry and have children as soon as they've reached puberty or shortly thereafter, often in their early teens, and usually to men much older than themselves. The men they're forced to marry already have several wives, as FLDS groups openly practice polygamy. Girls and women within FLDS communities often seem to accept their limited choices without question or resistance, possibly because they receive so little education aside from religious indoctrination, that they may simply not know any better. Girls are also taught that outsiders are evil and that if women do leave the FLDS community, they'll probably end up as prostitutes living on the street. Therefore, even if a girl or a woman is inclined to want more choices in her life or to reject the FLDS lifestyle, the obstacles that she faces will be a tremendous deterrent. Young men in FLDS communities also have their rights violated. They do not receive adequate education. They're often forced into working at a young age, essentially providing slave labor in their communities. And when they get old enough that they become interested in girls, they're banished from the communities so that there'll not be competition for the older men, that is, those who hold power in the community and who want all the girls for themselves. So these young men suddenly find themselves without any support in the mainstream of society, which they've also been taught to fear, lacking education and knowledge that makes it very difficult for them to get a decent job or to continue their education. In the United States, Amish communities, which are isolated groups of fundamentalist Christians, primarily oppress the children in their communities by only allowing their children to receive a grade 8 education. They fear that any further education may cause their children to acquire knowledge that will enable them to think independently, possibly resulting in their questioning and ultimately rejecting the Amish lifestyle. Although the Amish are often viewed as being peaceful and harmless, since they do not advocate any kind of physical abuse, the fact that they refuse to educate their children beyond grade 8 certainly violates their children's rights. Amish children simply are not given the opportunities that mainstream children have, and they face some of the same sorts of problems as young men in FLDS communities if they choose to leave. Their limited education creates enormous obstacles for them when they try to find a job or wish to continue their education. These obstacles may simply force these young people to stay in their communities, thus perpetuating the cycle of oppression. The rights violations, and thus the oppression, of women, children, and sometimes men also happens in non-isolated fundamentalist religious groups and families who live among the mainstream. Education is frequently a problem when fundamentalist religious parents either send their children to non-accredited religious schools, that is, schools that do not adhere to government-sanctioned curriculums, or they homeschool their children. It's difficult to monitor what these children are being taught or what they're not being taught. And if these children want to continue their education upon adulthood, they may be prevented from attending colleges and universities because of the shortcomings in their education forced upon them by their parents. The reproductive rights of women are sometimes violated by the practice of fundamentalist religions. For example, Catholics and Mormons are openly against birth control, removing any choice from a woman as to how many children she has and when she has them. If a woman's forced to have many children in quick succession throughout most of her adult life, her choices will be extremely limited, and she'll be unlikely to be able to enjoy the opportunities and freedoms that other women can enjoy. As well, the Catholic stance against abortion refuses to allow victims of rape or incest to terminate their pregnancies. Even when it's desired by the victims, they're pressured not to do it. One last example I'll give is that of fundamentalist religious practices that involve the refusal of medical care. Some Catholic parents refuse to allow their daughters to get the Gardasil vaccine, which would help prevent cervical cancer if the girl develops a particular sexually transmitted disease. Since the parents do not believe in premarital sex, they see no reason to protect their kids, and some even argue that having the vaccine will somehow promote promiscuity. Jehovah's Witnesses are against blood transfusions. In Canada, the government will step in, and they have done so in the past, and give blood transfusions to Jehovah's Witness children to protect their lives from their parents' religious beliefs. But one wonders how many adults have died because of this refusal to accept a simple medical procedure that may easily have saved them. There are also cases in which fundamentalist religious adults refuse to seek medical treatment at all for their children or for themselves, instead relying on faith healing or prayer. In these cases, particularly when children are involved, authorities may never even find out about it until it's too late and the child has died. When religious beliefs result in the unnecessary deaths of individuals who in many cases could have been saved with basic medical care, the troubling question arises as to whether or not these people have made a truly free choice, or if their religious indoctrination has inhibited their ability to think independently and to make choices that are truly their own. In fact, one can ask this question in all cases in which adults make choices that are in clear conflict with the individual rights that they should be able to enjoy. If these supposed choices are based on fundamentalist religious beliefs that these people have been exposed to since they were small children, one can legitimately question how much of a choice they really have. In all of the examples I've given of fundamentalist religious practices, I think it's clear that they violate individual rights and freedoms. And yet, despite this, one can find arguments to support the suggestion that societies like ours should accommodate these particular religious practices. The first of these arguments concerns the notion of group identity, and it suggests that the practices of fundamentalist religious groups are essential to the continued existence of the group, and therefore they don't feel that these groups should have to give up their practices in order for self-preservation. There are numerous problems with this argument. First, it assumes that the religion in question must maintain its practices in order to survive, but no proof is offered to support this claim. And the fact that non-fundamentalist religious groups continue to exist and thrive seems to indicate that they can continue to carry on without oppressing other people. This argument also argues for the adherence to traditional practices for the sake of tradition, without questioning the validity of the practices, or whether they're compatible within the framework of individual rights that we have in countries like Canada. This argument suggests that the rights of the group should take precedence over individual rights. That's what I was talking about earlier when I suggested that the right of freedom of or from religion must be interpreted as an individual right and not a group right. If freedom of religion is interpreted as a group right, then the group can decide what's in the best interest of itself, which really means what's in the best interest of those who have power in the group, which is usually only the men and sometimes only a few of them. The best interests of the group may involve the violation of individual rights, particularly the rights of women and children, in order to maintain the status quo. There does not seem to be any compelling reason to accept this group identity argument. If a fundamentalist religious group abandons practices that violate individual rights, and if this does result in the dissolution of the group, it seems to me that this will be better for everyone, except for the few who had power and control and used it to oppress others. Another argument is that the freedom of religion clause in our Constitution gives religious groups and individuals the right to do whatever they want and practice their religion in any way that they see fit, even if their practices violate individual rights. It seems to be the case that this argument has been used somewhat successfully, particularly when it comes to the FLDS community in Bountiful, BC. The governments, both provincial and federal, have thus far been unable to prosecute anyone in that community for rights violations, apparently because of their constitutional right to freedom of religion. If freedom of religion, however, were interpreted in the way I suggest, as an individual right, including the freedom from religion, then I do not think that groups like the FLDS would be able to use it to support their practices. As well, perhaps it may be necessary to stipulate in our Constitution that all other individual rights must take precedence over the right to freedom of religion to ensure that a person's life, liberty, and security is guaranteed over any actions that may arise from the practices of religions. Another argument in favor of the accommodation of religious practices that violate individual rights is based on the suggestion that people within fundamentalist religious communities or families freely choose to give up their rights. Therefore, they're not actually being oppressed. I've already raised doubts as to the veracity of such a claim. I think a case can be made that people who supposedly accept fundamentalist religious beliefs and practices that violate rights and even laws, that these people have been indoctrinated, often through extreme pressure, threats, and the instillment of fear, such that they cannot truly be said to be making a free choice. Furthermore, many of the people who are oppressed by fundamentalist religious practices are women and children who do not have any power to be able to change the practices of their communities or families, even if they wanted to. It's the very nature of oppression that the people being oppressed do not have a voice and they do not have a choice. If they did, they wouldn't be oppressed. So it seems rather absurd to suggest that they willingly choose oppression. The last argument I will consider that supports the accommodation of fundamentalist religious practices is based upon the suggestion that individual rights are not necessarily the best foundation for our society, and instead stronger communities should be encouraged. Those who hold this point of view are generally called communitarians, and they suggest, it's sometimes suggested within arguments for communitarianism, that individualistic ideals create lonely, isolated, and uncaring people who have no sense of belonging, and that only within a strong community can a person find an enriching sense of self, all of which are highly debatable claims. A communitarian approach to society advocates the existence of smaller, mostly autonomous groups who are allowed to make their own laws, decide what rights should or should not be granted to their members. So there would either be no central government, or if there is a central government, and it could be exempt from all of its laws and standards and instead make their own. The biggest problem with this argument concerns all the things that I've been talking about. Before one can even consider an argument that suggests that communities should be left alone to continue their traditional practices and set their own laws and customs, one must ask exactly what it is that's going to be preserved and perpetuated within these communities. It may be the case that the communities that one aims to support have practices that discriminate against individuals and that regularly violate individual rights. Simply arguing that communities can create strong bonds for people is not a persuasive argument because it completely fails to address the nature of the community in question and whether it's a sort of community that's justifiably maintained in the 21st century and in a country like Canada, since presumably these communities would exist within our borders. One major issue I have with a lot of these arguments is that we find them in academic publications, in essays and books written by professors. These are people who have never been oppressed. They've had all kinds of opportunities. They've been able to go to university. They've been able to have careers outside the home. And here they are advocating that other people are perfectly free to oppress other people, to deny other people the choices that they've had and that they've enjoyed and that they've been able to enjoy throughout their entire lives. And that seems to me quite hypocritical to come across these kinds of arguments in academic publications. The arguments that support the accommodation of religious practices violate individual rights all really boil down to one main claim, namely that fundamentalist religious practices should be accommodated simply because they're the traditional practices of the religion and they should be maintained for no other reason than for the sake of tradition. However, when one considers the practices that are involved, it's almost impossible to find any contemporary justification for maintaining them. These practices are often based on traditions that began when the majority of people were uneducated, that are based on archaic and incorrect understandings and knowledge of human nature, and that are arguably designed to maintain the power of a few over the many. On the other hand, when one considers individual rights, they're based upon the ever-expanding knowledge and understanding of human beings, derived from science and from reason, and from the recognition of past injustices. For example, one of the major advances in rights in the 20th century in Canada and in the US involved extending voting rights to previously disenfranchised groups. Women received the right to vote in Canada in 1918, except in Quebec, where they couldn't vote in provincial elections till 1940. And in the US, women got the right to vote in 1920. As for other disenfranchised groups, in Canada, the Inuit received the right to vote in 1950, while Indians living on reserves did not receive this right until 1960. And in the US, African Americans did not receive the right to vote until 1965. What these examples demonstrate, in addition to the fact that it's pretty shameful that these things happened as late as they did, is that it was simply impossible to continue to deny rights to these groups of people with no just cause, noting that gender and race were no longer seen as just cause for discrimination. Our current knowledge confirms that human beings are too similar to one another to justify different sets of rights and freedoms based on gender, or based on skin pigmentation, or on sexual orientation, or on the family or the religion from which one came, all of which are reasons given by various fundamentalist religious groups to support their discriminatory practices. Since our society is founded upon rationally established principles of individual rights and freedoms, we are justified in placing limits on the accommodation of fundamentalist religious practices that violate these rights, and these limits are entirely reasonable. I believe that countries like Canada must actively discourage and prohibit religious practices that violate individual rights, and I have a few practical suggestions as to how this may be accomplished. Authorities can try to do more to ensure that existing laws and constitutional guarantees of individual rights are being upheld, particularly within fundamentalist religious groups that are known to violate them. Perhaps this can be achieved through a special Department of Human Rights that could have a general advertising and education budget that would periodically run campaigns to remind citizens about individual rights and why they must not be violated. Perhaps representatives of this department could meet with members of all religious groups on a regular basis to remind them of their legal obligations to uphold individual rights. With regards to new immigrants, mandatory lessons can be provided that establish the importance that our society places on individual rights, and especially on equal rights for men and women. There should also be better ways to identify victims of individual rights violations. When the victims are adults, it may be difficult to identify them. Many women, in particular in traditional religious families and communities, are victims of systematic oppression, ranging from a lack of education to being kept isolated from mainstream society. And as a result, they can be effectively silenced or simply hidden. Perhaps a more rigorous census taking might be helpful to ensure that authorities would at least be aware of the existence of the women within fundamentalist religious communities and families. In addition, if, as I just suggested, authorities try to educate all members of fundamentalist religious groups to try to get them to understand that oppressive practices are unacceptable, this may eventually result in at least a reduction of these practices, if not an end to them. When the victims of individual rights violations are children, it can be easier to identify them or to take steps to ensure that they never become victims. Children could be required to go to mainstream schools, including both public and private schools, where they'll be able to interact with those outside of their religious group or immediate family. That way, if they're sick, injured, absent, someone outside their religious group or the family will be aware of it. Attending a school that's open to the mainstream of society will also encourage and ensure that children are being exposed to a broad spectrum of knowledge and thus receiving a comprehensive education and not only being exposed to religious teachings. As well, it could be made mandatory for children to see a doctor at a public health clinic on at least an annual basis so that any long-term conditions or abuses will not be hidden. Authorities can also provide more support for victims of rights violations. We already have in place agencies to assist victims of domestic abuse. Perhaps these various agencies can be expanded and provided with the means to get the message out to the public that individual rights violations of any sort are unacceptable, and to let victims of rights violations know that there's somewhere that they can go for assistance, whether they're being physically and emotionally abused, or whether they're just being oppressed in a way that denies them their rights and freedoms. My last suggestion concerns how authorities might deal with fundamentalist religious groups or members of these groups found to be violating individual rights. When criminal laws are broken, there should be absolutely no accommodation or leniency due to the fact that the actions were based on religious practices. harsh sentences, jail or major fines, whatever, should be imposed that would send out the message that violations of individual rights based on religious practices are simply not going to be accommodated, which may help to prevent some of these rights violations in the first place. Victims of rights violations should be encouraged to come forward, and their complaints should be taken very seriously, and they should be protected from further harm through the types of agencies that I've suggested if they do come forward. Another legal measure that authorities can take is to treat religious groups like other institutions and businesses that are held accountable for their actions. Religious groups could be monitored and audited in the same ways that businesses and other institutions are, to ensure that laws are not being broken, nor that individual rights are being violated. Tax benefits or tax-exempt status could be denied to religious groups who are found guilty of violating individual rights. As well, tax credits could be denied to people who financially contribute to religious groups who violate individual rights. These measures may provide some incentives for fundamentalist religious groups and individual supporters of these groups to observe and practice individual rights. In conclusion, if the government fails to enforce equal rights for women and children, and sometimes men, in fundamentalist religious groups, it could be interpreted by some as a validation of discriminatory actions. If the oppressive practices of fundamentalist religious groups are accommodated, even if only tacitly by the government turning a blind eye, and if no active attempt is made to put an end to these practices, then what incentive is there for these groups to change? What hope is there for people, especially women and children within these groups, ever to acquire the rights and freedoms supposedly guaranteed by the society in which they live? There is no justification for our society to treat a religious group any differently from any other group in society, or to treat members of these groups any differently from members of the general public. For instance, if members of the general public, not clearly identifiable as members of a religious group, commit acts such as denying a job or benefits to a person based solely on their gender, refusing to provide education to their children, physically abusing another person, having sex with a minor, or forcing girls or women to have sex, authorities would recognize clear violations of individual rights, and they would step in to try to punish those responsible and to prevent future occurrences of these actions. The same steps should be taken when individual rights are violated in the name of religion. And I think that these are very reasonable limits to religious accommodation. Thank you.
All right. Can people hear me, or is that's not loud enough? Turn this Hello? 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 How are we getting now? Okay. Is that, no?
The battery may have died on it.
Yeah.
There's a red light in the microphone.
Hello?
Suggests-
Hello? Yeah, that's better than, okay. Good. All right. So, that's certainly a very well stated point of view, and perhaps we have other points of view on the same matter. So who wants to open the discussion on this? And as I said, as our usual practice is to try to accommodate people who want to speak on the same sort of topic first before proceeding on to another topic. So could we have someone who wants to start off here?
Well, thank you. Very clear presentation, as you pointed out. However, it seems to me that one of the things you're suggesting, especially toward the end when you said authorities should do this, that, and the other thing,
Yes.
is it not the case then that you may well be in the situation of repressing the rights of individuals who have a different worldview, whether it belongs to a rationalist Enlightenment model or not? Is this not, are you not sort of becoming a kind of authoritarian who may well be indoctrinating others?
Well, I suppose the only defense I have for that position, and I have been accused of this before, so it's not the first time I've heard this, but I guess when I look at the rights that we have in Canada, and the rights that I'm trying to advocate that everybody should uphold, as I discussed a little bit, these rights are based on expanding knowledge, they're based on science, they're based on justifications that go beyond simply saying this is our tradition and this is the way we've always done things. And when we look at some of these religious practices, especially the ones that I pointed out, I have yet to come across an argument in favor of these practices aside from the fact that it is just the tradition. If somebody else has a better argument than that, I'd be happy to hear it. And so I think that the position to take to uphold individual rights simply has a stronger foundation than any position to deny those rights. And if that makes me an authoritarian, that's the way it is.
Well, just a further comment. One of positions like yours, I mean, historically, in my opinion, have been typified probably twice in recent history. One by, Marxism, which viewed itself as a kind of scientific approach to history.
Right.
The other, I suppose, was, a phase of the French Revolution, when, in fact, the revolutionaries saw themselves as implementing the ideas of Voltaire, Diderot, etc. Neither of which was, a happy sort of situation. So I'm a little worried about, being too glib about, accepting an authoritarianism of a scientific, secular kind.
Okay. I don't think it's authoritarianism, but because I think that the foundations for it are strong enough, and that there is. I mean, we're not saying that people can't practice religions. I'm not saying that people can't have a religion. I'm not saying that people can't have their own beliefs. I'm just saying that they can't use those beliefs to hurt other people and to cause other people, to prevent other people from enjoying life as they wish to enjoy life. And so if you're just privately practicing your religious beliefs and not infringing on anyone else's life, then I don't have a problem with that. It's just when those beliefs start to infringe on other people's rights and on other people's opportunities and the choices that other people can make, or if they actually abuse those people in some way, then I have a problem with them. So it's those specific examples of practices that can be shown to harm or clearly to remove choices from other people that I'm mostly concerned about. Yeah.
This presentation has been so clear, so cogent, so convincing that one longs to find something wrong with it. And maybe I can take you up just on the point that you made a moment ago, precisely about the question of whether assigning equal rights to different people is based, as you said, on science and research and things like that. And I don't think it is. I think it's based on a set of premises that have to do with logic and philosophy. Many years ago, I heard the philosopher John Wilson lecture, and in response to a question, he said that if you don't accept the equality, the moral equality of individuals, you're not doing philosophy. And I pondered that for some time, and it occurred to me that while you might like to make a case for somebody having some rights that someone else didn't have, it's much harder to make that case than it is to say, well, they're equal. We can't assume anything, so we have to assume equality. It's a philosophical assumption, not a scientific one. Would you like to comment on that point?
Well, sure. I actually did note in what I said in the talk, although I may have omitted this word when I was answering his question, is that individual rights are based not only on science but on reason. And by reason, I was sort of referring to those logical, philosophical arguments that you just mentioned. So I would agree with you on that.
Hi, not a philosopher. When you're talking about individual rights, I look at it as individual. When you look at individual rights, especially as they pertain to women and children, when people come to our country, there's a certain expectation that you're going to respect our rules and regulations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the bottom line. Really, you come here, you bring your religion, that's fine. Everybody's entitled to believe what they want to believe.
Mm-hmm.
But not to the extent that you're flouting laws. It's not a matter of being authoritarian. It's not a matter of stepping on anybody. It's more a matter of what the expected norm of one specific community is and whether you're willing to be a part of that or not.
I agree with you on that completely. And as I also pointed out, it's not just people who come to Canada that might hold beliefs that violate our individual rights or that might want to carry out practices that violate them. And there's certainly people who come to Canada that are perfectly happy with abiding by our laws and our rights. But it's also people who are here, they've lived here all along, that are just as guilty as doing it. We can't just single out certain groups of people because there are a whole bunch of them out there. And I guess what I would agree with you, it was, I guess, just looking at Canada and how, when I was briefly talking about how rights have changed and how, disenfranchised groups were given the right to vote and that kind of thing. There's all kinds of things, all kinds of rights that, women have been granted and that people of non-white men have been granted that they didn't used to have. And these have changed and evolved throughout our society. So we can take Canadian society, even if as it started originally, and as it's progressed through time till now in 2011, and see that we have changed the way we do things. We've adapted to new knowledge. We have recognized that practices of the past are simply not justifiable. We no longer can justify denying rights to women or to people of different skin colors simply on those bases alone. There's just no justification for that. And so you look at a society like Canada's and the individual rights that we have, and these have all evolved over time. They didn't just start in a book that was written 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. They've changed as people have learned more and adapted more and come to understand other people better. Whereas when you look at a lot of these religious practices, these fundamentalist religious practices, they're based on rules and texts that have never changed, that were written originally at times when people didn't have the understandings they have now, and when all kinds of discriminatory actions were just commonplace and accepted in society because that was just the way things were done then. And so these, I guess one of my points as well that I might not have made previously is that a lot of these religious practices are based on rules that haven't changed for centuries and centuries, whereas our rights and our rules have changed, and they've changed because we've come to the point and come to the conclusion that our old ways of doing things were no longer justifiable. So we've questioned the way we used to do things, and we've changed them and made them, I think, better and more equal than they used to be. And these are things that some of these religious groups have not done thus far.
I don't know if this has any bearing or not, but it struck me. Since all humans are not equal, does that have any bearing in selecting the rights, individual rights for humans?
I think the kinds of rights that I'm talking about, especially the 6 that I mentioned at the beginning, I don't see how you could deny that on the basis of people not being equal. I mean, I recognize that individuals aren't equal. Some people have greater or lesser physical strength, greater or lesser mental acuity. There's going to be all kinds of differences between people's abilities. But that doesn't mean that the basic rights that are guaranteed in our society should not be granted to them because of that. And so things like freedom of opportunities and freedom, the freedoms that I talked about, freedom of liberty and freedom of security of person and those kinds of things, freedom to have right to life and all those things. I don't see how you can make a case to deny any of those on the basis of the fact that people are unequal. It's kind of 2 separate issues. The fact that people aren't completely equal, because not everyone is going to be able to do the same things as other people, but that's a separate issue from the fact that everybody should have the same rights. The only time I would advocate any denial of rights to people is perhaps in cases when people have committed crimes. Obviously, we're going to remove freedom from mass murder and put him in jail, so he's not going to have freedom of movement and all the rest of it. So, and sometimes in cases if a person is severely mentally handicapped, then somebody else might have to look out for their rights because they're not in a position to make choices for themselves that might be good. So, there are cases when a person's rights can be taken away or given to somebody else to look after them. perhaps based on those cases in which those people themselves are unequal, but the rights themselves should stay the same.
So how do you think we can overcome the role of social ostracism in relation to religious oppression? Because if you guarantee a young girl in a fundamentalist religious community that they can choose, whether or not to engage in an arranged marriage, how do you think that we can deal with the fact that they will be rejected by their community if they refuse rights? How do we address
Well,
that?
that's definitely a problem. Like I say, I mean, my only suggestion on that was just simply having some kind of an agency available to help a girl like that. But I mean, if her family is determined to ostracize her, perhaps she might actually be in danger. I mean, that's one of the problems with some of these groups, is that especially if the girls speak out against what they've been told that they have to do, they could face serious repercussions from their families or their communities. They could be physically abused, they could even be killed in some cases. And I really don't know how we can deal with this at this point, other than just hoping that eventually these groups change. If we, continue to stress and make it, like I said, I mean, it might be a little bit naive, but some of these, educational campaigns and that kind of thing, just to try to get people to examine their practices and maybe realize that they're not good practices, and that they can continue to hold some of the basic religious beliefs that they have that just simply don't involve hurting their women or oppressing their women, and just try to get to talk to these people and find out what is it, why is it that they want to continue these practices? Why do they feel that they have to force their daughters to marry somebody against their will? What is that accomplishing? If they can't provide any rational justification for that, and I can't see how they could provide a rational justification, it seems to be all about power and oppression, then it shouldn't be allowed. And I don't really know, maybe just harsher sentences. There could be something in the law about people who abuse their daughters because they fail to conform to family standards. But it's a tough question. I really don't know what the answer is.
You're familiar with the controversy that has arisen in Quebec over legislation proposed or enacted, I'm not sure, to to prevent Muslim women from, under certain circumstances, wearing their chosen garments.
Right.
Now, I tend to support the position in those cases that we should maximize their freedom to choose to dress the way they want. But I know others will say, well, perhaps there is injury being done. They are injuring others. I guess the question I'm raising is, it's not always easy, is it, to know whether the practice, a religious practice, is actually causing harm or if it isn't. Could you comment on that?
Sure. I mean, there are most likely cases, and I'm not denying that there are probably women, Muslim women, who choose to wear the garments that they wear. They are under no threat by their families. Perhaps their families even say, you don't have to dress this way, but it's your choice. Of course, there's no way to know that if we see a woman walking down the street. And I suppose there is a tendency, if we do see a woman walking down the street completely covered with only a little slit for her eyes, that maybe there are some oppressive things happening in her life. It's hard not to think that she would dress like that. But to pass legislation, I actually have a problem with that just because of the way things are, and kind of relating to his question is the fact that these people are still enforcing their practices on the women in their families. And like in France, they've banned wearing the face coverings in public by Muslim women. And of course, France is doing this. I mean, the point of them doing this is to, try to enforce equal rights for women. But the problem is, if these women live in families where they're only allowed to go outside if they have their faces covered, And if the law says that they can't go outside if their faces are covered, then these women might be essentially prisoners in their own home because their family won't let them go outside without the face covering. And so I think in some ways that the law is going to backfire for some of these women, and it's going to cause more oppression, and that they're not going to be able to go out and buy groceries and see their friends like they used to be able to do when they had their faces covered. So that's a problem.
I think this question of what's harm or how we might do harm is a really important question to ask, because I mean, I'm trying to think from the perspective of a woman who has known nothing maybe her whole life but this system.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to say to her, oh, guess what, you're oppressed and I'm going to take you out of the system now, and I don't know if we have enough resources to help you completely change the only system you've known, and, you know, come up. I think if you ask that woman, she'd say, I'm not oppressed. This is the only thing I've ever known. And might become incredibly frustrated and fearful, and, you know, and I'm just thinking, we can't take care of women in our society right now. We can't take care of... Okay. No, I mean, I'm asking this as a legitimate question because I have seen what that kind of mindset can do. But I also think we can't take care of the women who are being, you know, violently abused or controlled, or, you know, even on a most basic level without religion. So I'm like, what do we do with this entire group of women? You know, how do we... Never mind, I mean, it's easier to understand in terms of children, but I think if you asked many of these women, the harm to them would come if you tried to take them out of the only thing they've ever known. So how is a new way of thinking possible to someone who's never experienced anything else? I mean, I think that's, I don't know what the answer is, but to me, it's a question to ask, are you doing more harm by taking someone out of the only mindset they've known, even if their rights are being violated? I don't know.
Well, I think that may be true, actually. I mean, I think if we were just to walk into, you know, if we went to the FLDS community, say in Bountiful, and said, okay, community's disbanded, women, you're on your own, well, obviously that would be just catastrophic. They have no education, they have no idea what to do out in the world. I guess I'm just kind of hoping that if we try to make it clear that we want people to follow individual rights and allow their members and their women and their children to have these rights, that perhaps things will change from within these groups. And it's not going to happen overnight, obviously, but if these groups, if we can somehow make them reassess their practices and maybe change their practices, perhaps over time, they can incorporate some of these changes by, you know, and maybe if these groups see that if they include women in more activities and give women more you know, power, that maybe it won't be so bad after all. You know, it might actually be quite kind of fun and interesting. So, you know, I'm obviously kind of idealistic, but you know, it's just, yeah, definitely just going in, you know, like an army and forcing change is obviously not a good idea. That's all.
Along this same theme, if I might make a somewhat inflammatory comparison, it seems to me your thinking on this subject has some similarity, it's not entirely similar, I'll certainly grant that, to the kind of thinking that went to the development of residential schools. I mean, it's the case that people in those days thought, look, these native peoples and their communities are really harming their kids because they're not properly preparing them for the Canada of the 20th century, and their practices are oppressive in various ways. So the thing to do is to take these kids away from their families and give them a proper British education. In replying to this, I want you to abstract from the fact that the abuses that went on in the residential schools are totally unconscionable, of course. But do you think that that whole idea of residential schools was sort of justifiable in the same way that you're sort of justifying maybe taking some of these extreme religious communities, breaking them up and and doing something with the kids which would prepare them for life in the surrounding society.
Well, I would not advocate taking kids away from their families and sticking them in residential schools. I think that's a really terrible idea. Like I was saying, when Rebecca was asking me that question, it would be best if the change could come from within. That if the families could, send their kids to regular schools. The kids could still come home to their parents at night, but they'll go to schools where they're learning what the other kids in society are learning, so that their kids will have the same basic education, the same opportunities that arise from that education, from our actually really fabulous educational system we have in Canada. And so I think obviously what was behind the idea, like you said, behind the idea of residential schools was the hope that these kids would have more opportunities and more choices if they were given a mainstream education. But to completely remove them from their families and then to abuse them on top of that obviously was not a good idea.
Yeah. Forget that.
Yeah, okay. So, it was the same. It was a similar principle, but I wouldn't go that far to say that these kids should be removed completely from their families. I would just hope to somehow convince their parents to let them go to regular schools and to let them get a regular education.
I want to press you on that a minute,
Right.
because this convince their parents. What does that consist in?
Well, I suppose you could make it mandatory. Like I said, you can make it mandatory that all kids have to go to an accredited school. And so, in that way, we can at least know what these kids are learning when they're not in their homes. And then, who knows? Maybe they'll go home and tell their parents about stuff they learned in school, and that might change things ultimately. But just instead of things like homeschooling or like non-accredited schools, of which there are a few, those kinds of things perhaps shouldn't be allowed. Just make school public for all children, and even private schools that still adhere to the same curriculum, that kind of thing.
And so what do you think of the sort of compromise that the Edmonton schools have arrived at, which is to allow public support for religious schools, and then just simply require that certain courses be given so that they can pass the examinations. But still there's a good deal of religious education which goes on in those schools.
I actually am not particularly pleased with that. I think that if it's public and paid for, I think our government should maintain a secular stance on everything, and anything that's paid for by the government should be secular. And if a religious school if people want to send their kids to a religious school that includes religious teachings on top of the regular curriculum, then that should be completely private and paid for, not by us. I think it's not appropriate for the government to fund a religious school.
Okay, firstly, I'm not an advocate of residential schools in the past, but I did know an elder that I was at university with, and she said it was great. She far preferred it to what she had been living with. As to changing lifestyles, we all know that you cannot change a lifestyle in 10 years, 20 years. You can't break fundamental beliefs overnight, but I have seen schools come to very good accommodations. And I'm thinking in one case where a very fundamental Christian sect had come up from the States. So the accommodation was, all right, we won't make you send your older teenage girls to school, but you send us your little girls that are in kindergarten. And I worked with these little ones, and there were some pretty strict strictures. There were some set strictures about what I could do as far as ESL and curriculum with them. I was volunteering there, but it worked. And I think at the end of the day, that's what we have to look for, because we are an accommodating society. We're not a repressive one. And to have people move into our norms, we have to expect that there's going to be time required. And we can't force people to change overnight.
Yes. I actually would probably, I would have a bit of a problem reaching a compromise that would involve, like when you say they're older girls not sending them to school, you're talking about like 15, 16-year-old girls?
It was a tough call, but they went into the home and taught them in the home and set up ESL lessons there.
So the girls were still getting education, they just weren't at school?
Some ability to learn how to read and write, yes. Because everyone was horrified at the thought if they were suddenly on the streets, they can't read and write.
Yeah, I mean, it might be that the most practical way to approach this will be to take small steps and to have small changes. If little kids, if little girls can go to regular schools, then, you know, hopefully by the time they're 15 or 16, they'll still be allowed to go to regular schools. Maybe their parents will see that, you know, the thing too is that there seems to be this idea that if children are allowed to do their own thing and have their own choices, that they're going to reject the religious practices of their parents. And so that to me kind of makes it seem kind of strange. If the parents are so concerned about their children dropping out of the religion by actually learning something and getting an education, then, you know, it makes you wonder, you know, are they that insecure about their religious beliefs that they're afraid that a little bit of education is going to completely destroy them? If they think that their religious beliefs are good and their religious practices are good and that they're justifiable and that they're strong, then they shouldn't be so worried about a little bit of education causing their kids to run screaming from their families, you know? So that's another thing. And that by trying to prevent your kids from learning things, I mean, like the Amish in the US have actually even admitted this, that if their kids get education past grade 8, they're probably going to want to leave the community. So, you know, if the Amish parents are willing to recognize the fact that, you know, a little bit of education and enlightenment is going to cause their children to realize that there's a better life, a more interesting life for them somewhere else, then, you know, it makes you realize that maybe these people aren't, you know, they are aware and that they know that the only way to maintain their practices and maintain their societies is to keep their children from getting very much education. And I don't see how that's something that we can just let go, you know, without trying to change it anyway.
Just an observation. It struck me that going into Bountiful and opening up and say you're liberated now and basically breaking up the community, it's the same thing as was done with the native school, where the kids were removed from their, basically the community was disbanded. So it's a good point for not doing it that way. I think one of your suggestions that the school, or for example, if we were really interested in bringing the native into mainstream society, maybe the teachers should have gone to the community, got familiar with the community, lived in the community, because I think it's very important as a teacher to be an example. And you cannot be an example if you remove everything and you do it well. This is the only way that it is.
Well, sure. I mean,
even for Bountiful,
yeah.
it would be a question of maybe bringing the younger king, like it's been suggested, and then try to influence it through, a more gradual process.
Yeah, I mean, if teachers were, you know, if outside teachers were to go into Bountiful and give these kids education, because it's a matter of public record that kids in Bountiful don't get really any education to speak of. They don't follow the curriculum at all. Girls really are taught that they have to be good. They're taught housekeeping and child rearing and stuff like that. And then they're forced to marry 50-year-old guys when they're 12. So obviously there's some serious issues there. So if they could send teachers into these communities and at least educate the children and just simply, and stop the child abuse. I think they can forcefully stop the child abuse. I'm okay with not letting that run out its natural course.
There was a program on CBC that was dealing with the subject, and actually it was very interesting. One of the ladies, definitely nicely brainwashed, was being sent to the Faculty of Education, I think in Vancouver, so she could become a teacher and then go back and carry on, basically. So that's
Yeah, I mean, every now and then, I mean, the BC government's been kind of hot and cold on what's happening in Bountiful. It depends on who their premier is and who their attorney general is. Sometimes they'll go in there and try to make some changes and try to make sure that the education is being covered. Sometimes they'll just stand back and not do anything. So they haven't been consistent in their approach to what's happening there. But I mean, if, you know, even if one of their so-called brainwashed women gets an actual, you know, Bachelor of Education degree from UBC or whatever, and comes back to Bountiful and teaches the curriculum, that's way better than what they have now, so absolutely.
First of all, a comment on what was said earlier. I find it very amusing that the French and Belgian government, you know, inheritors of the Euro Enlightenment, are up in arms over a couple hundred or maybe a few more hundred women who, sorry, is that better?
Yeah, keep it close to
Sorry, let me repeat that. I find it very amusing that France and Belgium, two inheritors of the Euro Enlightenment, are up in arms over, you know, a couple hundred or more women who feel like dressing the way they do, or maybe they're oppressed, maybe they're not, as you said. Why does that happen, of course, is another issue. I don't want to get into that. But my question to you is something different. From what you said, it would seem to me that you accept the nation-state's monopoly of violence and law. Would that be correct?
What do you mean the nation-state's monopoly of
Well,
violence?
the government of Canada, for instance, or the US, or any other government which is the only source of lawmaking and the only source of violence, of, say, it has the army and the police, and nobody else should have that. Would you agree with that? Well, somebody
Well, I like
accused you
to
of being
think,
an authority.
yeah.
Somebody, go ahead.
Yeah, I like to think that Canada, I mean, I can't really speak for the US, but Canada is fairly democratic. We do elect representatives. The way that we have spending limits on campaigns allows a lot of different sorts of people to run for office and become elected politicians to represent, hopefully, the views of their constituents. Our first past the post system can be a little bit unfair, but all in all, we don't have such a bad system, and it's fairly democratic. And if we really don't like the way the government's doing something, we can elect a different government. And so I think in a mostly democratic society like ours, it's best to have a central lawmaking group, because if you didn't have that, if you decentralized it, then what would you sort of suggest as an alternative?
Well, I don't have an alternative.
Oh.
It's just that there were other models before. For example, in the Ottoman Empire, while Ottomans were ruling, you know, they allowed each individual Christians, Jews, Muslims, even sects within them, to have their own laws. So and that, you know, certainly worked, you know, at that point in time. I don't know whether it will work today or not. It's just a question. But see, the thing is, when you take the monopoly of law and violence with the state, only with the state, what happens is, you mentioned, for example, you know, a group of people who, fundamentalists, religious, will take over, and there'll be mostly men who will make the rules within that community. Well, I could say the same thing about the conservative government today. You know, they're making the rules for a certain number of people. You know, and it may be changing, thankfully. But certainly, you know, they've made the rules so far, and as a brown person, you know, I might not agree with a lot of what they do. You know, I might agree with some of what they do, but not a lot.
As a white person, I don't
Since
agree
they're
with
only
most of what they
40%,
do.
they were elected only by 40% of the
Exactly.
current of the population. You know, they're not really representative of the country.
Well, like I said, that is a definite problem with our system. We don't have proportional representation, and that, I think, makes our government slightly less democratic than it could be, in that you get people who got the minority of the vote having a massive majority government, and therefore pretty much being able to do whatever they want. And I don't like that idea, but it's for the most part, I don't like some of the government policies and that kind of thing, regardless of whatever government happens to be in power. But they still seem to have a sort of rational approach to at least the laws and rights of the Constitution. I mean, they're not, you know, rewriting the Constitution while they're in power or something like that. If they were, then you know, I don't know, maybe we'd have to overthrow them.
Sorry, just to carry on a little bit away from there,
Okay.
is coming back to who's in power and who's not.
Right.
You know, in the corner of Jasper and 101 Avenue, there's a little group of people who tented out with camps called Occupy Edmonton.
Yeah.
They represent a whole lot of people, probably 99%, so they say,
Most of us, I would think.
who are today protesting about oppression. Economic oppression,
Right.
rather than religious oppression, which is a far bigger issue than religious oppression. Or would you not agree? And would you say, for example, that that requires priority today? It's when, you know, when Joseph Stiglitz, for example, talked about the government of the 1%, by the 1%, and for the 1% rather than the other. I mean, the people on the street clearly know, you know, what's going wrong.
Right.
So it's a few people who are controlling, who are oppressing, and the people who are on the street are liable to be hurt by their very own army and by the very own people, by the police, who should be controlled by them, by the people rather than by the 1%. So I mean, I think it's a much bigger issue today than, or is it not, than religious oppression. Far bigger if it's the 99% who are arguing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's definitely a huge issue. I mean, I'm not saying that the government should drop everything and just focus on religious oppression. But we can't just ignore religious oppression when we're dealing with these other issues. I absolutely agree with the Occupy Wall Street, Bay Street, whatever people. And I'm, you know, as horrified as they and everyone, the other 99% are by the fact that 1% owns and controls so much of the world. And I think that's terrible, and I think that something that's definitely something that has to be dealt with. But I don't think it's an either or. I don't think it's like, well, you either deal with religious oppression or you deal with the oppression of the rich or the poor. We could do both, can't we?
I'd like to take up that topic of oppression because it seems to me that your basic thesis is that we should not tolerate practices in religious groups which are oppressive, right? Either of their own members or certain subsets of their members or of other people. So the question really is, what is oppression? And my basic worry is that practices which are entered into by consenting adults, that is, that the people in some of these religious communities are quite comfortable with the practice which you would think and I would think is oppressive. But does that constitute oppression if the people, so to speak, being oppressed don't feel oppressed and in fact are quite content with the practice?
Well, that is definitely a difficult issue. And like I was talking about a little bit, one might wonder, I mean, all of us in this room presumably haven't been seriously oppressed. Here we are on a Saturday afternoon talking about these things. So we don't really know what it's like to be oppressed like that. But it's hard for us to imagine that a person who hasn't been exposed to any other way of life or any other way of thinking is really in a position to even recognize their own oppression. I mean, it might just simply be a case that people don't know that they're being oppressed and that they willingly go along with it. I mean, but that's an assumption. You know, maybe these people, especially the adults, maybe they are aware of life outside of their communities. Maybe they do occasionally read a newspaper or surf the internet and see that things are quite different in other communities in other parts of the world, and they willingly choose the community they have. So if they have a choice, if they could live differently than they do, and if it could be the case that they could live and make different choices than the ones that they're doing, then I would say that they're not being oppressed. But if there's no way that they could make another choice, if that's the only thing that they could ever possibly do, I mean, if a person chooses to, if a woman chooses to get married when she's 16 or 17 and have 10 kids and stay home and look after them, knowing that there's other things she could have done with her life, but choosing that instead, that's okay. Because she's had choices, she's had other opportunities, and she just chose not to follow those. But if a person isn't even aware of other choices or other opportunities. I mean, if they're truly not aware of them, and if, as in some of these communities like the FLDS, I mean, they tell their kids that if they leave their communities, they're going to end up as prostitutes. I mean, that's the choice: stay in the community, get married when you're 12 and have a pile of kids, or be a prostitute. Well, they're not really being given a choice. And so even if they get to be the age of 30 and say, this is the life that I want, well, if the only choice they thought they had was being a prostitute, then it's not a choice, and they are being oppressed, even if they're not aware of it. But it is, I mean, it's easy for us to say that these people are being oppressed, and it's not always easy to see that they recognize that. And aside from just providing more education to people, I mean, education is so important, and just, you know, to end, I mean, even just looking in history, as, you know, when more people became more educated and women became more educated, they weren't satisfied with not being allowed to vote and not being given certain jobs, because they just realized that this wasn't fair. And so maybe if women within these communities eventually get more education, then they'll see that maybe the life that they thought was perfectly fine actually isn't. I mean, there were probably lots of women who never even questioned the fact that they couldn't vote. Although I hope not, but maybe, you know. Whereas it eventually became quite clear that that wasn't justifiable. So, and that's because people, perhaps because they were educated better. So maybe education will dissolve those illusions.
Yeah, where I'm going here is that is the state justified in interfering in arrangements between individual citizens, which those citizens feel comfortable with, just on the grounds that, you know, well, actually this is harmful to some of them. But I mean, it's the same could be said about marriage arrangements, right? I mean, some woman might accept a very restricted kind of marriage, which her husband doesn't allow her to get a job or anything like that, and she's just supposed to stay home. That's what the Germans say, Kinder and Kuchen. And suppose that she is perfectly comfortable with that. I mean, should the state be interfering here at all?
Well, I guess the role that I would want the state to play is to make it clear to these people that they do have a choice, and to show them what some other choices might be. And if they still choose to do what they do, then you know, we can't do anything about that. But we should at least.
Well, so what would you do? I mean, you sent a social worker around to this married couple and their family, and the social worker explains to the woman, well, you know, you could be having a job.
Well, she would presumably know that. I mean, you know, I mean, nobody.
Well, I mean, presumably in these religious communities they know that, right?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily,
Yeah.
but I mean, I think in most cases,
Yeah.
right? I mean, in my own family, my wife's son is the head of a Muslim family, and belongs to what you would call a fundamentalist Muslim sect. And the women in that family and in that community all wear the niqab as well as the shador and the hijab. But you know, I talk to them quite frequently, and they're very happy with this. Also, they don't think that there's any point really in much education for women, and maybe not even that much for men. You know, the kids are quite happy with that, and they expect to fall into the traditional kind of lifestyle that this community has. Now, I'm just wondering, I mean, you say you're against accommodation, but what does that mean here? I mean, if you're just going to say, well, you know, let them, you know, see what's going on in the community around them, then they'll be able to make choices. Well, that sounds very much like accommodation to me. So if you're against accommodation, it seems to me you've got to be in favor of interference.
My reaction is that you have answered that question. I don't believe we can willy-nilly go in and intrude into people's lives that way. But if you require, as you said earlier, that every child attend a mainstream school, you always have to start with the children. And so when they learn as children that there are all these options, that's our only hope, is that eventually many of them, not all, will choose to exercise those options. So again, we have to fall back on strong public school education and not leave education in the hands of these groups.
I agree, absolutely. And what concerned me, Martin, about what you said about this family, is that they don't think education is important. Well, that's quite horrifying, actually. And that just seems to perpetuate this cycle of oppression. If they don't think it's important and they don't bother educating their kids or themselves.
Yeah, it's horrifying to you and me and probably most people here because, I don't know, just about everybody here has actually been to college or university as a, but that's not the case with these people. Now, you're in effect saying that you should interfere in these arrangements to push yours and I guess pretty close to the majority view of education on these people.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
You're okay?
Sorry.
I'm actually very fascinated by your talk. I find myself agreeing with what you stated as some basic human rights. I think all of these ideas are very valid. Each person has something to say. I think the larger question, and I feel humble talking about philosophy in the presence of so many well-educated philosophers, but I think we're dealing with ethics. The question being whatsoever good, and that is what is good, what constitutes good. You're saying if we have those 6 rights, then it'll be good, and I don't disagree with you. And then we talked about oppression, but to a certain extent, democracy is an oppression. If only a minority of us votes, and a further minority of the minority says that we want PC in government, so in fact, we do not represent the majority, but the ideal there is that the majority rules, you see?
Right.
Well, that means that if a whole bunch of decides we should all jump off the cliff, that should be right, and you should follow us, because the majority of us says that's right to do. So the problem with that, the fallacy of democracy is that the majority rules, but then the majority must be right. I don't think one follows the other necessarily.
I would agree with that, actually. The majority might not be right in some cases. And I guess what I was talking about before is looking at the justifications for why people do things, looking at the justifications for what their practices and their customs and their rights are. If the majority said, let's jump off a cliff, well, why? I want to know why. And if you can't give me a good reason, then
The reason simply is, that's the truth, that's right, because we say so.
Well, I don't buy that, because I think that I've actually suggested a stronger argument than that for my views that.
Dictatorships, communism, Marxism, all of those runs on that basis.
Mm-hmm.
It's right because we say it's right.
Well, I don't agree that things are right because we say they're right. I think that they're right if
But
we.
you then therefore follows that those 6 rights that you had mentioned may very well serve your purposes.
Mm-hmm.
We have to come back, whatsoever good. What is good for you may not be good for the next person.
Mm-hmm.
I think oppression is, I decide what is good, and then I instill, I force, I coerce, I abuse.
Mm-hmm.
I force those ideas onto you.
Right.
Just because I decided that's good.
Mm-hmm.
And what's good for me, I decided for you and all my children, and therefore it's good for you.
Mm-hmm. Well, what reasons
And
do
the
you
hidden
have for
problem
that?
with that is, what if I'm wrong?
But have you thought about it? I mean, if you were to make a decision of that magnitude, that you would actually force your views on someone else, would you look at the reasons for your views, the foundations? Would you be able to offer a persuasive argument to somebody else and say, look, this is why I believe this is why I think this is right, and just listen to what I have to say. And if the other person listens to what you have to say, and they think that what you say makes sense, and if you have some really strong, valid reasons for your point of view, then they might be persuaded to go along with you and say, yeah, I do think that you're right, or at least more right than some other guy.
So now you go into another area, it's called value systems. What you're valuing is based on science or statistics.
Reason.
This family that got pushed, the car got pushed into the Riddle Canal, that died. The value system that is at work that I don't agree with is family honors. It is for the name of the family.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore we sacrifice these family members. That holds value for that individual. It's not to say that he's wrong to hold values. It's just that I don't appreciate his values.
Well, like I say, I just think that there's a stronger argument that can be made for individual rights and for the rights that I talked about. And I think that they are based on logic, on some, foundation of science, reason, logic, philosophy, whatever you want to say, ethics. I mean, I definitely think I'm advocating an ethical position. And I think that if you just simply say, I want to do this because I think it's right, and that's the way it is, that's not an argument. You're not providing any reasons. And so if you're just making a judgment like that, I don't think that's a good enough argument. And I think I've provided a much better argument from my point of view.
I think I'm going to have us take our break now. I see a person in the back there who wants to speak, and I'll come back to you right after the break. But it's an interesting point at which to break. So please get some refreshments there from Steve's, and we'll get back to this discussion in about 20 minutes.
Okay, I'll keep it brief. First thing I'm going to say is I'm very irked by the people in the park, and my first question would be, did you vote? We're a very complacent society, but we do have some fundamental rights. And one of them is to get off our butts, be an advocate for ourselves and our communities, and be participants in our whole parliamentary system, in our right to fight, in our right to vote. So they irk me. Maybe not so much in the States because there's a lot of hungry people down there right now. But we're pretty lucky in Canada, from my perspective. And I work with a lot of people who are very poor. My other thing is, well, I'm not advocating for social workers to go into everybody's home. I do respect the right of the individual to worship as they choose, provided they're not pushing it on myself. I also volunteer with a group of individuals who have not had the opportunity to learn to read and write. And then they suddenly come into our country and they look at me and they say, teacher, what can I do? I don't want to live on welfare. I do not want to ask for handouts. I want to work. So I absolutely believe in the fundamental right for all individuals to an equal education. Now, how that education is presented, I really don't give a rat's ass, excuse my English. So long as they're getting the core instruction that will enable them to survive in our society. I'm not speaking to other societies outside of our North American model. I'm speaking to the one here where the expectation is you are able to read and write and look after yourself and provide for your family. Good, bad, or otherwise. That's the reality of it.
You want to respond to that, Lisa?
I agree that everybody should vote, and it's really dismal that such a low percentage of people vote. So I'm in agreement, and if those folks downtown didn't vote, then they deserve a whack on the side of the head, very gently, of course. And of course, I agree with your points on education. So.
I would like to ask you, what exactly is the content of the education which you would say should be enforced for all children? You simply said an education which allows you to make a living in this society, which of course would involve reading and writing and I guess some numerical dexterity.
Absolutely.
Of course, I think we would all go along with that. But I wonder whether you're willing to take the next step, which is to say, and also be educated in those things which are necessary to going on to, university education, taking advantage of those opportunities, because that involves a great deal more. That involves a lot of education in science and history, for example.
Okay, I'll try and explain myself a bit here. When I was referring to those little girls, I was respectful of their family's wish that there be nothing that involved fairy tales or anything outside of the family. So I went out and found books that dealt with family. I had a student whose biggest wish in life was to be able to sit down and read the Quran in a group. I don't care what you teach your children to read and write with. If someone wants to go on to a higher education, that is their right. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody wants to. Everybody should have the right of choice, the right to make the choice what they want to do once they have the basics, and the basics should be sufficient enough to allow them to make those choices and go on to them if they choose to.
Yeah, I mean, glad you brought up the example that you did, because a normal high school education would involve education in, the standard classics of English literature. And that's the sort of thing which people who go on to university are expected to have. So I'm wondering, to throw this question at you, Lisa, I mean, it strikes me that the program, I'm sorry, what's your name?
Jennifer.
The program which Jennifer put forward first is extremely accommodating, if that's all that it would require. And I'm wondering if you are really that accommodating.
No, I mean, I would hope that when kids go to a school and get the kind of education that I'm talking about, that in addition to math, just basic arithmetic and reading and writing, that it would also include science and history and English and, philosophy would be great, some critical thinking and logic would be really helpful if you taught every kid that, so that they could at least learn how to think, even if they don't ever bother thinking. I think that would be quite helpful.
Yeah, helpful, but would you enforce it? That's the question I really have here.
Well, I think that some kind of a critical thinking course should be, logic, philosophy, whatever you want to call it, should be required for at least to graduate high school. That would be nice, I mean, it doesn't have to be, they don't have to read Plato or anything like that, but just logic, practical logic and critical thinking would be a good thing to have.
Oh,
But
I think Plato should be required.
No.
Go ahead.
You just replaced one odious religious system with another, I think. I'm wondering, Lisa, I've been wondering, I agree with everything you say and with the thrust of it. I guess I would quibble about some of the details or wonder about them, of course. But I'm wondering, especially about this, like, I don't see anything basic in your position that has to do with religion, except, as it were, secondarily. I mean, what I hear you saying is that there's a range of recognizable oppressions, particularly as regard upbringing of children. They're wrong, they're not justifiable, and they shouldn't be permitted, and we need a fairly flexible, maybe I would be more flexible than you would be, but a flexible system to try to circumvent that, undermine those oppressions, bring the kids into something that's better. Oh, Sorry. Can you hear me better now? So what's wrong is the oppression.
Right.
And what I hear you saying is, you sometimes make comments that seem to be critical about religion, and I can be quite ambivalent about religion. But it seems to me your position really isn't about that, but rather that religion, among other things, is no justification for those oppressions and shouldn't be allowed to get in the way. Would that be right?
Yes.
Okay, so it would be possible, for example, to have a thoroughgoing Muslim education that, or Catholic education or Jewish education, whatever, that where kids act, maybe even it was a separate school system, but where the kids learn deeply about history, science, literature, and so on, right?
Right.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that all religious people or all followers of religion oppress their kids, their women, and all the rest of it. I guess I just, in our society, there are discussions about whether religious groups should be left alone to do their thing. And even though they might be doing the same things, I mean, oppression happens outside of religion too. You're going to have people that just have no affiliation with religion who are still oppressing people, and their women and their children and the rest of it. So I'm mostly saying the same rules should apply to everybody, and as you said, religion should not be an excuse to get around those rules.
Yeah, okay, I realized I had a supplementary in that, but I think we probably would agree there too. Just that in these issues, there can be this tricky tightrope of trying to protect the freedom and life opportunities of people, especially kids, on the one side, but with respect for the right of parents to raise kids, the right of people to live on their own terms. And I mentioned my own ambivalence about religion because I have to, particularly when I go to London and I see in one particular neighborhood I visit, women everywhere wearing the niqab. I mean, I have to say, it bugs me. And I'm saying to myself, well, it's the right of adults to live on their own terms and so on, but it bugs me. And it seems to me in these issues that becomes a problem. That's to say, we can see people living so differently that it can be difficult to accept that it might still be an authentically chosen life. So that we have to separate or find a way to identify where it is authentically chosen and where it's just the expression of a lifetime of oppression.
And that's the hard part, and I don't know how to deal with that.
Just to clarify, I believe in a good, solid education that prepares people to be critical thinkers. So when I'm saying basic education, I just kind of assumed everybody would know that story.
No worries.
Well, I think what I was concerned about was, I too, of course, agree with that sort of education, but what we're concerned here with is enforcing it on children who come from some sort of a community, a religious community, which objects to much of English literature, objects to much of biological science, right? Objects to a particular view of history, which is ensconced in most of your historical textbooks. I mean, to what extent should the state get into the business of enforcing that? It's not just a question of what's a good education. There's no disagreement about that. The question is about the limits of state enforcement, state intervention. Right? Now, I think we would all say, I would say that the state should intervene to make sure people are literate and have, some numerical dexterity, and have some sort of knowledge of the institutions of society around them. Because you can't get on at all without that, right? But now the question is whether the state should also enforce something deeper than that and more expensive.
Well, are you saying that the state should only be allowed to enforce a curriculum that enables people to, what was the phrase used, survive? Get on. What about the enrichment of life and the achievement of potential and learning about human rights and civic rights? And it seems to me that is necessary that the state enforce that kind of an education, basic education. And that's the way we can address in the long run, by requiring all children to attend a public school where those subjects are part of the core curriculum. That's how we can best address this issue of oppression within
Absolutely,
these
I agree
groups.
with you.
There's an issue that is a little bit peripheral perhaps, but it touched a raw nerve, and I'll feel better if I can have it out.
Okay.
It was the idea that fundamentalism relies on something unchanging, on a fixed interpretation perhaps of traditions or of life, where, what shall I call it, freedom accepts change and novelty. But as a historian by trade, it seems to me that fundamentalism has sources and was not given in some age-old form. I think every fundamentalism in the world today can be analyzed in terms of circumstances that brought it into being. It wasn't always that way. And conversely, when change is apparent, how often that change goes back and in fact represents a strand of tradition and perhaps a new analysis of the tradition rather than something absolutely new. And if I may take a rather prominent example, Jesus was working in a tradition, and he would say, "Heard that it was said of old time, but I say unto you," and he would then re-evaluate or recast the tradition. So it seems to me that the relation with the past is much more complex than what you seem to imply. Maybe I'm assuming
Oh yeah, I mean,
an
I did kind of simplify it
oversimplification.
because I didn't want to spend 10 minutes talking about what fundamentalism means.
Yes.
So I mean, it was a simplistic approach.
But I think one way to approach fundamentalism is to look at its origins, and it always has origins. May I stop there, and if you'd like to comment further?
Oh, do you have a specific question or
Well, no, this is just, as I say, this is just something that touched me as a historian. I thought, no, this is way too simple.
Yeah, well, I think actually in the sort of the definition I gave way at the beginning of my talk, when I was talking about, they either follow sort of a set text or something that's unchanged, or the religion is interpreted by a particular authority. And so in those cases, there might be changes. If a new leader comes along in the religion and says, this is how I interpret it, and this is how we're going to live, then it might be different from the way it was done 50 years ago or 500 years ago. So in that way, it's not absolutely static. So if I implied that it was absolutely static, I'm sorry.
I'm glad to have that
Okay.
out.
Yeah, I too was a little bit bothered by your sort of remarks about tradition. Always remember that line from Fiddler on the Roof, where the main character, what's his name? tradition. So, I mean, a lot of communities in the past have maintained their identity by firm adherence to traditions, right?
Right.
Your remarks reminded me a little bit of sort of the extremes of French Enlightenment rationalism, where you know that something is a tradition just isn't any sort of reason whatsoever for giving any backing to some present practice, right?
Mhm.
Every practice has to stand before the light of natural reason and argue itself there, if it's to be given any sort of right to stand.
And you don't like that idea?
Yeah, I think that's extreme. I mean, I suppose I'm a certain sort of a conservative. I mean, you sort of need to respect the traditional way of doing things and adjust it as is needed, clearly needed for changing circumstances, right?
Yeah. I mean, some
but the
traditions
fact that
are
some-
not bad. I mean, traditions that say that you should, treat other people with respect and help your neighbor if they need help. Those are good traditions, and they can also be, scrutinized and be given a more rational argument to justify them. But I mean, certainly not all traditions are bad and should be abandoned. But I suppose maybe I am extreme in that Enlightenment sense that I think that traditions should be examined from time to time and look, people should look at why they hold these traditions. So I guess I am that way.
my point is, I guess I would say that the fact that something is a well-established tradition or custom, right, is an argument for it on its own. I mean, a certain large burden of proof then falls on somebody who wants to say this custom or tradition should be dropped.
I'll let them answer.
Can I suggest that maybe the way we are using tradition is the way I choose to reinterpret the past? Because if I want to look for tradition, for example, just say to look at the Catholic religion, there was a time when women were quite powerful. And then the Holy Father came along and screwed it all up. If you look at Islam, there was a time where women were well educated. So is what I choose. Like, for example, I could go back to the Bible and say, let us kill all the son of a bitches out there, and the God is behind me, right? So which tradition are we going to use? I think it's an excuse to go back and say, I interpret it this way or I interpret it that way. It's got absolutely nothing to do with really a sense of tradition. There are no tradition. There is way things have been done sometime. And if I choose the time period I want to impose, then I can say, let us go back to the God of Israel who killed or smither all the enemy. Or could we go to Jesus Christ? Could we go to Buddha? Could we go to Muhammad? Whatever. It's just a very loose way of trying to justify what we are doing today. Thank you.
Well, I would say that I would say yes, the fact that something is traditional is an argument for honoring it, but if that's the only argument, and they can't offer anything else, then it collapses. And I believe that basic education required by a state curriculum ought to value critical thinking, which is prepared to examine traditions and reject them if they have nothing else to offer but, well, this is the tradition.
I agree.
the market, neoliberalism, and war are also traditions, but we value them. I mean, and coming to education,
Who's we?
the we, the 1% who literally drive the world today. Because if I come back to education, the politicians, the generals, the soldiers, the pilots who pilot the bombers, the pilots who send the drones down to Afghanistan, Iraq, etc., they're all highly educated. Some of them have second degrees, not just undergraduate degrees. So what does education do for all of them? And if we say that education is, we need to educate people, well, here is one result of education. And I could go back into history and find, for example, when I read Edward Said, he talked about the generals who sent the bombers to Vietnam. They recite their Lord's Prayer on Sunday. Or George Steiner, for example, talking about the Nazis. They went to, they ran the camps during the day, and in the evening they went to opera. So what did education do for them? So what is it about education that we think can change things?
But I don't think it's entirely fair to point out the horrors of the world. I mean, you could say that education caused the atom bomb, so therefore we shouldn't have education. I mean, I don't think that looking at the negative things that have arisen from education is enough to discredit education. Look at all the amazing things that have come out of education. The people have been able to create amazing technology that helps life. They've come up with all kinds of amazing, advancements in science and medicine that has enabled people to live longer, healthier lives and prevent people dying from diseases that they used to die from. All these things came about as a result of education, art, a lot of things in the artistic world, music, and literature, poetry. A lot of these things come out because people are educated and are aware of these things. So there are a lot of amazing, beautiful things in the world that came about because of education. And there are bad things are going to happen coming out of education too. People are going to use their knowledge to create bombs and to fight wars. But they're also going to use it to help humanity and to make the world a more beautiful place. So maybe that's just human nature, I don't know.
Besides, it's a tradition now.
Well, one of the things that sort of has struck me, and again, first of all, our society claims to be a democratic one which honors diversity, but really, most often, in my opinion, the diversity we honor are what you might call soft forms of diversity. In other words, we like falafels and strange and exotic foods from other parts of the world. But when it comes to hard diversity, we're much, much less tolerant. But is it not the case that the very virtue of our society is that it engages in debates around what you might call those hard, diverse issues? In other words, that we engage in discussions about, well, we fundamentally might disagree about, let's say, the equality of children and adults, for instance, in the modern world. Should children at age 14 be allowed to vote, or are they not old enough? We've settled it in other areas. So what I'm suggesting is there not a place for diversity, and is that diversity not best represented by, let's not call them fundamentalists, but by a kind of person who is, for lack of a better term, extremely serious about a certain point of view? And would your approach not sort of eliminate that?
Well, I suppose I might want to, if a person's point of view, I guess it comes back to this whole issue of justifiability, and if you can actually find a reason to support the point of view. And some point of views just aren't as good as others. They aren't supported, they aren't justified. If my point of view is, if I strongly hold the point of view that I should be able to sacrifice a kitten every day, well, I don't really have a particularly good reason for doing that. And even if I had a reason for doing that, I can't imagine that it would be a particularly good one. And so we can't just say, well, because a person believes something strongly, that their view is a valid one that we should take seriously, because they could believe something that's really quite harmful and totally irrational. So I think we need to look at what views are being discussed. And I'm not saying that society has to be filled with people who are, completely in agreement with me on everything. Because I'm still perfectly okay with people having all kinds of various beliefs and practices that are things that I would never do or that I would never want to do. But as long as they just don't harm or oppress other people. So I mean, there's still a lot of room for diversity in my idea of what would be a really good society. It's just based on those sort of, just don't violate someone else's rights while you're being diverse. So diversity is good in other respects. Just not when that diversity involves harm and oppression.
Anybody else want to chime in at this point? Or have we covered the field here? I guess we have, and I think we should give a real hand to Lisa. Put her on the spot a lot of times here, and it was very good. Now, hold on a second. Yes, so I want to thank the staff at Steeps for hosting us today. And we're going to meet again in 2 weeks' time and have that discussion of that enormous topic about civil democracy and being enough of a unifier of a country, something like that, right? And thank you all for coming out, and have a good day.